Welcome to the HC Commodities Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. This podcast is produced by HC Group, a global search firm dedicated to the commodities sector. Today we're talking weather, climate, and the role of a meteorologist within the commodities sector. Understanding weather, as well as longer-range climate changes, profoundly impacts both trading desk performance as well as investment decisions around expensive capital projects that often sit around coastlines. Yet weather events around the world are increasing in intensity and frequency. Forecasting those is getting harder. What does that mean for the sector? What does that mean for the world? Our guest is Matt Lanza. Matt is the lead meteorologist at the energy company Cheniere, as well as a writer for Space City Weather and The Eye Wall, and has had a long career as a meteorologist within the energy trading sector. As always, you can really support the show by leaving us a positive review on the platform you're listening on, or follow our show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really does support us and allow us to access more listeners. And as always, I hope you enjoyed the episode. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Paul. It's great to be here.
Yeah, and I'm glad we can finally find the time, because obviously we've had this postponed a couple of times by hurricanes, no less. So poignant to the topic.
It's been one of those years.
Exactly, and that's what we're here to discuss as a energy meteorologist. Ultimately, kind of what are the key things that I guess keep you up at night, but also what are some of the more structural challenges in both forecasting, but also what that means for investing and the nature of the energy infrastructure we have, which is by and large coastal, certainly when it comes to things like LNG and so forth. So there's it's going to be interesting. There's quite a bit to get to do, but I guess I just want to sort of start off on the trouble with forecasting, if you'd like, or the challenge of forecasting, both those elements that have been there forever, but also perhaps what's changed in recent years in terms of some of the volatility, if you'd like.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great place to start. So, with hurricanes and tropical storms in particular, the challenge with forecasting is just, it's multifold, right? Because you have to, you're trying to predict the track of something. You're trying to predict the intensity of that. And oh, by the way, the intensity may actually impact the track in some ways. And then on top of all that, you obviously have the human ramifications of where these storms go, and what it means for people and things and infrastructure. So, we've gotten a lot better, I think, at track forecasting, and at least since I've started, over the last 15 to 20 years. We've gotten a little bit better at intensity forecasting, but I think we're seeing time and again storms, just kind of surprise us. In terms of what they end up doing. We had that storm Otis in 2023 that hit Acapulco and kind of almost out of nowhere became a Category 5 as it moved into Acapulco. We've seen storms this year, Beryl, Milton, that have just blown up faster than expected. Like, we still expected them to intensify, but at the pace and rate that they did, it was kind of overwhelming to us. And so, I think we have a little bit of work to do there in terms of trying to improve that forecasting element of things. Certainly we've gotten better. Certainly we can anticipate a lot of this stuff, but we can't always do it as well as we can with track forecasting, where I think we've had several instances, particularly this year, where the track forecasting has been phenomenal. We've had these storms nailed down days in advance as to where they were going to go, or at least generally where they were going to go. With the exception of maybe Beryl, when it hit Texas, was a little bit of a challenging storm. But overall, I think we've made significant strides in that. I think we'll continue to see it get better. But really, ultimately, what becomes the most challenging aspect of all is how to explain all this to people and how to get them to understand and make decisions that are based on the forecast that we see. Because it kind of starts with us. It's up to us to let people know what's coming. And that's really been, the hardest. It's kind of that, I like to call it kind of the last mile of forecasting, is where you're not trying to make decisions for people, but you're trying to help them make very informed, specific decisions that will help them mitigate issues during a storm. And that's where I think a lot of our efforts are being utilized right now.
Just to set the scene a little, I guess, meteorologists forecasting has been fundamental to an energy trading desk, an energy business, almost since inception, right? As it's a major source of volatility, or an edge if you can get it right. And then secondly, can you give us some sense, just the nomenclature around like what's forecasting weather and what's forecasting longer range climate?
Yeah, there's a lot of different elements that go into weather forecasting, as it pertains to the energy industry. On sort of the one hand, you've got sort of that very short term forecasting that matters, and that goes along with hurricanes and tropical storms and their direct impacts. But it's day to day things too. How hot is it going to get during a heat wave? How cold is it going to get during a cold outbreak? Where is it going to be extra windy? Where's the wind going to be too strong? And then you're talking about wind turbines that stop blowing at certain wind speeds. So as the advent of renewables and the expansion of renewables is changing a lot of the forecasting, because now you're not just forecasting demand, you're forecasting supply as well in a lot of cases. So trying to get a handle on those sorts of things is certainly a challenge. And then you kind of step it out to, from that shorter range forecasting to the medium range. That also includes hurricanes and tropical storms. Where do we think the next threats are going to show up? What are we looking at in terms of hotter than normal weather or colder than normal weather, depending on the season? And where will that be? Because if we have an extreme cold blast that hits, Montana and North Dakota, sure, that matters, but it doesn't matter as much as one that's going to hit Chicago or New York City or Texas, some of these other places. So there's nuance around where the cold or the heat goes and things of that nature, and it's kind of up to us to try and forecast that to the best of our abilities. And then going out further in time, we're still not perfect in the Holy Grail, which is the subseasonal time frame. Getting that week 3 to week 6 kind of figured out. We're making a lot of improvements in how to forecast that, but even just to get it consistently right directionally would be a huge boon to people that are planning around what energy demand, what supply is going to do. If you could do something with wind or with solar energy, obviously it gets a lot trickier, when you're dealing with things that localized. Just to sort of talk about the subseasonal time frame for forecasting, but once we can get better at that, that really unlocks a whole lot of possibilities, I think, in the industry for both meteorologists and people making decisions off meteorologists. And then you take it a step further to seasonal forecasting, which is always kind of a roll of the dice, and it's getting even harder now because I think respect to climate change, it's something you have to consider and think about, if only because maybe some of the relationships that used to stand up, that we were expecting, El Nino or La Nina, or we're expecting blocking in Alaska or blocking in Greenland. What does that mean? There were certain constructive relationships that have always been there. What if those are moving? What if those are shifting and changing? So now you're kind of not just trying to get something correct from a forecast perspective, but you're also trying to nail down this moving target of how things are moving around. And so it really creates challenges. So I think, just as we're starting to see improvements in certain areas of like subseasonal and seasonal, we may also start to be losing some ground too, just simply because of shifting, relationships because of climate.
Yeah, and I guess we're going to come on to those, because the other thing about that is that there is non-linear, right? You can have these small adjustments in well-known mechanisms that can have outright enormous impacts. Just staying on the forecasting bit, so what's getting better? And I think you've sort of shared what's kind of getting more challenging, which is some of these longer range relationships changing. But what's driving better forecast and what's causing challenges?
Yeah, so I think one of the really cool things that we're going to see a lot more of with the advent of machine learning and AI, we're now integrating that into weather forecasting. The whole industry is like obviously trying to catch up and take stock of what this actually means. But from a weather forecasting perspective, particularly just this summer, looking at some of these AI forecasts from like the European model, they've got the classic European model that everyone talks about, the European versus the American. What does it show? Well, now the Europeans also have an AI model. And what it has done, in my opinion, I don't know if you talk to 10 meteorologists, you might get 10 different answers, but in Matt's opinion, it has done phenomenally well with tropical systems and their tracks, not just from it gets it close to correct early on, but consistently showing it. Like once it locks in on a solution, it locks in. A lot of these other models that we look at, they can be subjected to noise and what we call like windshield wiper solutions, where it goes from one side of the Gulf to the other with a storm, or it has a strong storm one run and a weak storm the next. I don't think the AI models are quite as susceptible to that, which is encouraging. Like that gives us, it's not your number one tool that you're going to use all the time and without looking at anything else, but it's another strong tool to add to the toolkit that could sometimes be used as almost like a tiebreaker in certain forecasts. And so what I'm interested to see is, as we get more and more of these AI models out into the field, how do they handle other things? How do they handle snowstorms? How do they handle cold air outbreaks, Arctic outbreaks? How do they handle heat waves? We got a little bit of a look at that, I think, this summer. And I think we'll get more of a look kind of going into, this winter and next summer in terms of how they handle some of those temperature extremes. But how much can we trust them? And then obviously the next question is, what does that mean for the rest of the industry? Will everybody have their own AI model in 5 years that kind of tells them what they want? Or that you're running the GFS model faster than the next person because the computing power that it takes to run these AI models is substantially, drastically less than it takes to run the physics-based models. So I think that's one area that's going to see a lot of change, and both has the potential to produce really positive outcomes, but also new challenges as well. So it'll be interesting to watch. I'm excited and real curious to see how this plays out in the next 5-10 years.
And you've touched on something there, because it might be quite fascinating to some listeners that it's a real competitive advantage having your own meteorology team within an energy trading desk. And this holds true for around the world, because, correct me if I'm wrong here, it means that you're not relying on sort of public sources that are available to everyone. You're using the raw data to hopefully get more accurate answers, but also get those answers more quickly than your next nearest competitor to get on the right side of a trade. Can you talk to that a little? I think that's sort of it's something that's become more and more critical to an energy trading operation.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I will freely admit that I'm very biased in this one, because I know, I've done this now for 10, 15 years, and I know what it's like to be on the trade floor and see how it is firsthand. I think many businesses, not just in energy trading, but elsewhere too, need to consider having meteorologists on staff, because I think, first of all, there's kind of two elements to this. Number one, you want to be prepared for what's coming. So you want to understand what everything means, and just having that expertise in house, somebody that can learn, your business, learn the pinch points, and learn what specifically impacts your decision making. Then you've got somebody that can look for, how weather will shake out and play into those decisions that you have to make. But then number two, even with the AI modeling that I just talked about, there's already a torrent of information, and there's just going to be more and more and more of it. You're going to be swimming in weather information in a few years, more than you already are now. So, when I talk to students that are meteorologists, I tell them, look, you want to be able to be a technically competent person, somebody that understands programming and things like that, so you can help some of these shops build out their own modeling and things like that. But at the same time, you've also got to be an information translator. You've got to be able to say, like, hey, we've got all these different models now. What are they showing? What does it actually mean? And so having that sort of ability to have someone translate data into insights, quantitative data into qualitative insights, I think is super important, and will only become more important in the years ahead as more and more of this weather data becomes available. So yeah, I'm a huge proponent of having an in-house meteorology team, person, whatever, in addition to all the other sources of information that you utilize from some of these third-party companies that service the industry. But beyond that, I think all businesses, major businesses, need to think about this as well.
Yeah, exactly. Especially as it becomes, potentially more challenging to forecast some of these longer range impacts, but also, as those impacts become increase in intensity. We're recording this in October, so we can slightly, use the season to scare ourselves a little bit. But I guess when, we first started discussing this, it was kind of off the back of interesting posts that you've been doing on some more sort of potentially obscure climate events that are going on, rain in the Sahara and so forth, but are indicative of quite broad shifts and changes in weather patterns that could have profound effects. Using a few examples of the kind of, well, let's start with events. Let's start with hurricanes, right? And obviously, as I mentioned at the start, this is critical because in the end, lots of real infrastructure is sat on coasts, especially places like the Gulf Coast or parts of Asia that are hurricane prone, and we're seeing these events. Well, what's going on? Are they increasing in frequency, intensity, and yeah, give us some sense of that. And obviously, from a planning standpoint, an investment standpoint, it's a big deal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, this is only getting more and more challenging as time goes on and we keep racking up some of these, significant events. I think what we're seeing is we've seen a lot this summer. I think there's lots of elements to kind of unpack in terms of particularly the Atlantic, in terms of how hurricanes are behaving. Number one, we've been kind of on this crazy train since 2017 of significant hurricanes impacting Gulf Coast states. We've just had kind of one after the other. I think it started with Hurricane Harvey, and now it's continued with Helene and Milton this year. And so we're constantly getting tested here. And some of that, I think, is obviously due to the fact that the Gulf is warmer than it has been in the past. We've seen, just objective data show that the Gulf is warming, and it's not just that the temperature is getting warmer; the depth of the warm water is getting a little deeper. So you've got more ability for these storms, more energy for them to feast on as they move into the Gulf. So for Gulf Coast assets and facilities, you've got to think about these things and what does it all mean. There's been research that's been done into how climate change is expected to impact hurricanes and in particular Gulf hurricanes, and you kind of get a mixed bag of results with this kind of concept that there may be fewer storms on the whole, but bigger ones. The ones that we do get are bigger, and we've seen that this year. That's come to fruition, but you can't just pick one season and cherry pick that and say that that's indicative of everything that's going to happen. But I think that there's an element of that. Like so many storms this year have become hurricanes. Several of them have become high-end hurricanes, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that the water is so warm, in the Gulf and the Atlantic. But on top of that, you're also seeing some research that points to Gulf storms starting to slow down a little bit when they come inland, forward speed wise. So, they're able to dump more rain on certain areas. And we've seen that, we've seen that with Helene. We saw that with Milton in Florida. We saw that obviously with Harvey, with Florence in the Carolinas a few years ago. And you can go on and on and on with some of these, big prolific rain producers. And that's not to say that storms like this haven't happened in the past. They have. We know this, but are we getting them more frequently? Are we getting them more often? Are we getting the high end of rainfall being 10 to 20% higher than it was 50 to 100 years ago? These things matter because we build things to certain designs, right? I'm not an engineer, but, everything is built to a certain design and a certain expectation. And if that expectation is going to change, and a lot of our infrastructure is built based on the old expectations, well, then you have a problem. And so I think it's important for anyone, planning anything in the Gulf to just be aware of what's been happening and what's changing and, what could happen. The problem with climate change is that you are taking a lot of scientific research and you're putting a lot of faith into it of things that haven't actually happened yet, but that we're seeing signs of, that the data points to. And you can either ignore that or you can accept that and say, okay, well, let's be a little bit extra cautious and a little bit extra robust with our planning, in case it's right. I know not everybody wants to hear that, but I think that there's an element of that that's really important.
The energy and resources sector is experiencing unprecedented change. To help companies navigate this world and capture its opportunities, HC Group launched Enco Insights in 2023. Enco has rapidly become the leading global expert network dedicated to energy and resources. Enco Insights leverages HC Group's 20 years of connections and dedication to the sector to give clients the expertise they need to take decisions fast. Connect with Enco's experts for anything from a 1-hour insight call to a longer-term consulting project at encoinsights.com.
I mean, one thing that strikes me as well is, which kind of surprised us, I guess, around Beryl to an extent, which cost me a few roof tiles. You've seen it with Milton, really. You certainly saw with the storm off Acapulco. Is also, it's not just a question of frequency, intensity, but also the rapid appearance of these storms. Unpredicted 2 days before, and then suddenly they come around. They're Cat 5, and they hit 2 days later. A lot of the infrastructure that's in the Gulf with regards to offshore oil, typically has a few days warning to get out the way, right? As do onshore large facilities. That window might be shortening, it would seem.
Yeah, and I think that's something that a lot of planners have to be thinking about, is that we're seeing so many of these storms that just kind of blow up, like we said, out of nowhere almost. And, it used to be that you had this whole idea that you could evacuate a place, you could move people, with a certain amount of time, a certain amount of lead time. Well, now if you don't get that, how many false alarms you're going to have if you just start evacuating people, just in case, and what are the ramifications of those false alarms? So, I think this goes back to your question about, hey, does it make sense to have a meteorologist on staff? It does, if only to understand this better, not just from a day-to-day business and trading standpoint, but also from a business continuity standpoint, and being like, hey, you can give maybe a little bit more of a heads up on something as a meteorologist in-house than the Hurricane Center can, because the Hurricane Center has a mandate to do certain things, and they do a fantastic job of them. But for a lot of businesses, when they issue a hurricane warning, it's too late for them to do everything that they have to do to prepare their sites, to prepare their people, to shut down their assets if they have to. All these different things that kind of go into it. Having that in-house expertise is really critically important, and it's only going to get more important as we see more and more of these storms that rapidly intensify, like Beryl, like Milton, that do these things and will threaten infrastructure on the Gulf or elsewhere.
Right now, many of our listeners in Europe and beyond are probably thinking that it's all fine for them. They don't get hurricanes. But, and I guess this is the second example, which really is an example of that longer range change and some of these foundational mechanisms that have created the notion of a stable climate in our lifetimes. These things have changed dramatically in the past and can change in the future, and the outcomes can be quite spectacular. And one that's in the news a lot at the moment, and people refer to the movie The Day After Tomorrow, but is let me get it right, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, the AMOC. And this is as I understand, it's been in the press quite a fair bit. This is obviously a key driver of why Europe is much warmer than it should be. When you actually look at relevant latitudes to places like London and northern Canada.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of fascinating. I'm actually reading a book right now about El Nino and history, and how some of these sudden climate shifts, it's not just about El Nino, but some of these sudden climate shifts have managed to cause civilization to change, cause political ramifications in terms of leadership and stuff like that.
This is ancient Egypt. You can almost track sort of dynastic changes with El Nino, right? You can also do the same in Europe in the Middle Ages with sort of bad harvest 3 years, plague 10 years later, kind of thing, right? I mean, they do have profound society consequences.
Yeah, and we have good evidence of how these things happened, based on climate science and some of the research that's been done. The AMOC is just another element of that, and it remains kind of mysterious. which is both interesting and scary because we only know so much about these things. And even like the best experts on this stuff don't even fully understand what is the trigger that causes that to collapse and shift and then get us all of a sudden cold again.
Can you describe what it is first? Like, what actually is it doing today? And then we've seen a significant weakening and perhaps a tipping point by 2050, even some people say, or certainly by the end of the century. So, but what is it today? What does it do today? And why is it so critical to, balmy summer evenings, and the thwack of, leather upon willow?
Yeah. So, basically the way the world works with ocean currents is, everything moves around in certain directions just because of how the Earth rotates, how continents are placed, how weather works, all these different things. And so with the AMOC, basically, is you have the Gulf Stream that sort of takes this warm water that forms in the tropics of the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico and gets funneled off the Florida coast, up the East Coast to North Carolina. And then you've got the Gulf Stream, which obviously goes across the ocean toward Europe, the North Atlantic Current. And you end up having this much warmer ocean water off Europe at high latitudes. So you can get somewhat balmier air. If that weren't there, Europe would be cold, very cold, and not nearly as habitable as it is today. And so what the philosophy about all this is that at some point, what can happen is that can reverse. And all of a sudden you're flipping, and instead of the warm water going up toward the Arctic, you get colder water, more fresh water that comes down from the Arctic and passes by Europe. And because that happens, you get this change in weather from the more temperate type climate that Europe has right now to something far more ferocious and colder, with more blizzards, glaciers forming in mountains, and things of that nature.
Basically, Alaska.
Exactly. You turn the UK into more of an Alaska type place,
which is on the same latitude, right? It just doesn't have
right.
this Gulf Stream. And I guess the reason what's causing this change, I know it's unfair to sort of try and dig into this, but is obviously green salinity, and then you've got Greenland melting and all this kind of stuff that changes those relationships.
Exactly. So you've got all this deep warm water that's very high in salt content that's coming up, the East Coast and then over toward Europe. But the theory is that, as Greenland melts, as some of the ice caps melt more often, you're flooding some of the ocean water in the North Atlantic with more fresh water. And all that changes the composition of the ocean to a point when this happens at scale, that at some point there is a tipping point that nobody really knows exactly where that point is. But if it happens, it has profound ramifications that would be economically and socially devastating for particularly Europe, but also elsewhere.
Yeah. And at the moment, I understand it. And again, it's hard because obviously it's hard to find historical records on this stuff, but it's weakening at the moment to a rate of 10, 15%, quite significant shifts, over the course of any given 5 years or so. And as you say, that tipping point, we just don't know when it is, but it might be quite close around the corner. And it's kind of like, these processes have happened naturally in the past, on long turns and so forth. But obviously there's the anthropogenic side here that's making the rapidity and scale of change enormous. But it's just that sort of the unknown non-linear outcomes of some of these changes is quite frightening.
Yeah, and it's definitely one of those things that keeps you up at night, not just as a meteorologist, but as a human, that kind of understands this stuff, and just knowing what that would look like. And it just, nobody's ready for that, right? As much as we, and it's not like, one of the interesting things with that is it's not all of a sudden that a switch gets flipped and everything changes in a day. This takes time. This will evolve over years, but you have food shortages. You have more ice, more snow, more problems in some of these places when that happens. And, just the adding up of all that is what leads to, not civilizational collapse, but just a collapse of what we're used to, what we've grown comfortable with in the last, 1,500 years.
Well, yeah. And, God, I don't want to make light of this sort of stuff, but, there's a certain amount of which, Europeans might want to start being a bit nicer to North Africans because, that whole sort of migrational equation might swap quite quickly.
No, I think it's a great point. And, it's interesting. Like I was saying, I've been reading this book about this stuff, and all these civilizations have found ways to, they either adapt or they end up getting wiped out, right? So you have to adapt to that sort of thing. And
I find that all fascinating. We did an episode, actually, people go back on in December a couple of years ago, about how you could track the fortunes of the Roman Empire to climate shifts, right? And these are relatively minor shifts, actually. I mean, one of the challenges of sort of ancient civilization was, of course, if you're the priest king, and you're there because you're the one that can, intercede with God, and make sure the harvests are good and all the rest of it. If they're not, it's a pretty fragile position to be in. And that's becoming a more, as our climate data gets better through new techniques and so forth to understanding historical climate, we're getting a much sharper image of that and how it impacts civilization. And you see it, arguably today, right? A lot of the disturbances and volatility around the world can be directly tied back to climate change and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. And it doesn't even have to be, the type of climate change that you hear about in the news all the time. It can just be seasonal climate that leads to unrest somewhere. And a lot of times we talk about that, and people are just like, it's climate change, it's weather. Like, no, that's part of what we're talking about. Like we said, it doesn't happen all at once. This takes time, and it builds, and it's just a building of tension and grievances and everything over time. So there's a huge psychological element to all this as well.
Let's finish up on El Nino and La Nina, because again, I guess, can you help us understand exactly, sort of roughly speaking, what that is? And it would seem that we're seeing, again, a kind of more and more years that are defined as one or the other, and fewer ones that are defined as neither.
Yeah, exactly. And so, like, you go back in time and you look, and every so often you'll have a period of El Nino, a period of La Nina. So El Nino is just when the water in the equatorial Pacific Ocean is warmer than normal. And we measure this in a particular area around the equator, from about the date line to South America. And there are specific definitions. It has to be at least, I think, a half a degree Celsius above or below normal for 3 months for it to be classified as either or. If it's warmer than normal, it's El Nino. If it's cooler than normal, it's La Nina. If it's not any of those, we call it, neutral, ENSO neutral. I like to call it La Nada. Your mileage may vary on that. But a lot of the weather that moves across North America and across the Atlantic into Europe and Africa, all that is kind of sources itself in either the Indian Ocean or the Western Pacific Ocean. And then it's sort of everything starts from there and ripples downstream. And when you change the complexion of the Pacific Ocean around the equator, it has generally significant impacts. In the United States, a La Nina usually means a dry south, hotter than normal weather in the south, and a very cold northwest, western Canada. El Nino usually means a wetter California, a wetter south, and at least the potential for some colder outbreaks across the east, depending on the strength. A strong El Nino, like the one we had this past winter of 23-24, usually means warmer than normal weather almost everywhere, and that's kind of what we saw happen this past year. What we've seen has kind of been interesting. Like, it's almost like in the last, I don't know, since 97, 98, when we had a really big El Nino. That's when you had the Chris Farley skit on SNL, I am El Nino. And it sort of entered popular culture then. But since then, we've had a series of basically La Nina events, and then kind of interspersed with sort of these punches of El Nino. 2000, I think it was 9-10. It was either 9-10 or 10-11 was an El Nino event. 15-16 was an El Nino event. And then last winter was an El Nino event. And last winter's El Nino event followed 3 straight La Nina winters. So, like you said, you're not seeing as much of the ENSO neutral. Now, I don't know how much of that is just better observation and we're better able to understand this stuff, or how much of that is actually, something that's going on, again, with the climate. And it's been hypothesized, at least, that in a warming climate, it may skew the Pacific actually to more La Ninas, which is kind of what we've seen in the last 10 to 15 years. And whether that's, just a trend or a blip or whatever, we'll obviously know at some point. It looks like we're going back into La Nina this year, so here's another one, possibly this coming winter. And so, it's important to kind of just understand this because, again, these relationships matter and these relationships may not be static, and things may kind of shift and change in time being. I thought it was kind of interesting this past winter. We're talking in Texas here. Usually El Ninos are very wet in Texas. And while this past winter had, a decent amount of precipitation to start, there were a lot of really dry stretches, and we're kind of going back into one now. And so it's interesting to see sort of those things happen. We had an El Nino a few years ago. I think it was the 15-16 El Nino, where California didn't get like any rain, and then they got it the next year. So it's not to say that relationships are ever perfect. They're not. But, what's going on? What don't we know? What do we need to learn more about? And what's actually changing in the background that we need to kind of better understand so that we can adjust our predictions, accordingly, because it's important from a seasonal perspective to get these forecasts as right as possible.
Yeah. I mean, I always think about sort of the hydroelectric world, right? Where you've got large South American countries, significantly reliant on it. And you have these, I guess it would be La Ninas that are making it, drying up the Pantanal and all the rest. I mean, and these things have real challenging impacts, on agriculture, on energy production, as well as on people. And that sort of flip-flop between those two, La Nina, El Nino, is causing, that itself is causing significant disruption.
Yeah, and I think as the energy market is kind of globalized a little bit more with more LNG and more, more interplay between the Americas and what's happening elsewhere around the world, we're seeing more of a sensitivity to these things. These things matter a lot more kind of on a global scale than they did, 5-10 years ago. So for the energy meteorologist of the future is going to have to understand not just the weather in their backyard, but the weather around the world to help their traders make better decisions and position themselves better for what to expect.
And that's key there, because as I understand it, right, you take a country like Panama or Brazil or whatever it might be, right, and you've got this base load of hydroelectric, and historically, kind of the balancer to when the hydro is low or whatever it might be would be things like fuel oil or coal, which are relatively easy to store, right? But now all that is switching in the energy transition to things like renewables, of course, but also LNG, and that's a much more challenging product to store for any given time, right? So you're having to get more granular on these forecasts for just these types of global events, where as a trader you can take advantage of it, as a local government you need to be prepared for it.
Yeah, about 12 years ago or so, I worked for an investment bank, and I would get questions about South America a lot, but it was related to agriculture. And today, all the questions I get are: how's the drought? What is the precipitation situation in Brazil? And what's going to happen over the next few months? And so, it's going to be really important to understand those relationships and understand if they're changing. So there's a lot more knowledge that's going to need to be gained and ascertained by people that are forecasting weather around the world. I'll admit, like jumping into forecasting for Europe and Asia and forecasting in the Southern Hemisphere, I wasn't prepared for that coming out of college. So that's been a whole new world for me. And it's been fascinating and fun to learn. But, going forward, it's going to be extremely important for everybody to recognize the importance of that.
I find it fascinating, right? Because you could have thought, when you were, a college grad right now, and you're thinking about meteorology, I'm sure there's an uncle out there saying, "Oh, it's all just going to be AI'd away. Don't worry about it." But the point is, the AI is a tool, right? That is, there's more data, and you're going to get more insights. But unless you have a meteorologist who can actually ask the right questions of the data, that gets you a competitive advantage or a more accurate view, and then, as you say, who's communicating it in a manner that can then be actionable, AI is going to do you very little good at all, right? And I imagine, as you say, over the next 50 years, whatever it might be, meteorology is going to become more important.
Absolutely. And it's everybody's like, AI is going to replace humans. No, it's not. AI is going to create more work for humans to have to interpret things. Obviously that's not true everywhere, but at least in our little world, it's going to just be another tool that we have to add to the toolbox and utilize. And it's kind of like you said, ChatGPT is a great tool for doing things, but it's not the tool itself that really makes it useful. It's how you prompt it. And the people that can be the good ones at prompting ChatGPT are going to get the best answers for whatever questions they're asking. And I think the same holds true for developing models. Who can prompt these models to do certain things the best way possible? Who can ask the correct questions? That will help with the answers. And I think that's going to be a huge tool for meteorologists and a lot of people in a lot of other fields too in the future.
Well, it's been fantastic. Do I get one bonus question that I've always
Absolutely
public service? Like, what does it mean on your My Apple app, right? When it says I've got 70% chance of rain.
So you can ask 5 meteorologists that question. I will guarantee you get 5 different answers. And so this is why I hate probability of precipitation. But in most cases, and this is how I interpret the Apple app to mean it, what you're predicting is what percentage of a forecast area, or what is the percentage within a forecast area that it will rain on that particular day or at that particular time. So it's not that 70% of the area is going to be covered by rain. It's that there is a 70% chance of rain somewhere within some mythical box that includes your area, that it will rain. And so there's an objective component to that. You're obviously looking at the weather models to make that determination, but there's also a very artsy subjective component to that as well.
Which is the box.
Exactly. Like, how big's the box? Where is the box? And everybody will give you different answers for it. So, it's tough to understand. Probabilities are not easy. So
no, I do sometimes get quite frustrated, as you know, when it rains here. Sometimes it can rain pretty hard, and these percentages seem to be. But anyway, very interesting. I appreciate the answer. Well, Matt, it's been a real pleasure to have you on, and it's great to hear some advocacy for your skill set and discipline within the commodities world. I could put links to your blogs in the show notes. And look, hopefully we don't have to talk again in 2 years about why Northern Europe's frozen over, all the energy infrastructure is gone, and why there's droughts. God forbid. But it's been great having you on.
Yeah, sometimes gallows humor is the best way to get through it, right? But no, thank you, Paul. This is great.
Thank you for listening. To find out more about HC Group, our global offices, and our expertise in search within the commodities sector, please visit www.hcgroup.global.